So the mid-season update for Season 6 brought with it some pretty big druid buffs that allows one of the most iconic druid builds to become quite a bit more viable. So in this video, I wanted to go over a werewolf tornado druid build. And while there was a handful of buffs that affects this build, I think the one that buffs the build up the most is the buff to the Storm Chaser's legendary aspect, which is used in every other tornado build, because this is the aspect where Tornado will now seek up to 5 targets, so your tornadoes will actually track enemies, but now it adds a damage increasing component, which gives you up to 50% multiplicative damage increase to Tornado. So just getting that big of a damage increase off of something you would already be using is a pretty big buff to any build. And then on top of that, through all of the other buffs that hit a lot of other builds as well, this build just got a pretty massive buff in general. But that brings us to our skill tree. Starting with our basic skill, we're going to be using Maul primarily so we can shapeshift into Werebear and back into Werewolf to proc a ton of effects. Then you're just taking upgrade 1 to get lower into the tree, then 5 points into Tornado, our main damaging ability. Upgrade 1 has a chance to spawn an additional Tornado every time you use Tornado, and then upgrade 2 Tornado can now make enemies vulnerable. And because of how many tornadoes we'll have out at a time, and because they can constantly be hitting enemies, most enemies will become vulnerable very quickly. Then we're going down 1 point into Earthen Bulwark, just a big barrier. Upgrade 1 makes us unstoppable, which is the main reason we're using this. Then 1 into Bloodhowl for a big heal. Upgrade 1 reduces the cooldown on kill. Upgrade 2, which is the primary reason we're using this, gives us increased attack speed. So you want to be using this as much as possible to constantly have that additional attack speed. Then I'm using Debilitating Roar, makes all enemies around you deal less damage. Upgrade 1 fortifies you, but the main reason we're using this, upgrade 2 gives us increased damage while it's active, and this is multiplicative, so just a pretty big damage buff. Then we're going all the way down. We're taking our ultimate of Cataclysm, putting 5 points into this. The primary reason we're using this is because this will proc a bunch of other effects, especially one from our unique ring. Cataclysm mixed with some of those other effects is also how we will have unlimited spirit usage. Upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2, it makes everything vulnerable. Now you can take this point out of Cataclysm that makes everything it hits vulnerable, but because you have Cataclysm up 100% of the time, it's very easy to just make sure everything is vulnerable alongside our Tornado, just to make sure you always have vulnerable. But if you feel like this is an overload of vulnerable, you could either take this point out or take out the upgrade for Tornado and just put it in another passive. And that brings us to our passives. 1 is a Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more, but deal more damage. And because of how this build is created, you don't have to worry about how much spirit your Tornado costs or how much spirit regen you have, because we'll have unlimited spirit. So this is just a very big damage increase. Then we have 1 point into Predatory Instinct to go down to put 3 points into Iron Fur, which is just some pretty big damage reduction. We'll have both our Maul and our Debilitating Roar to bring us into Werebear to get some damage reduction that persists for a little bit to just allow us to be a little bit more tanky. Then 3 into Backlash, increase damage after using a defensive skill. We have 3 defensive, so this will be up majority of the time. 3 into Ancestral Fortitude for increased resistances. 3 into Vigilance for damage reduction after using a defensive, which again will be up most of the time. Then we're going and putting 3 points into Nature's Reach, deal increased damage to distant enemies, double this if they're CC'd, and we have multiple ways of CCing enemies, so a pretty big damage increase overall. Then Feral Aptitude, you deal increased damage while healthy and increased damage while above 100% move speed. These bonuses can stack, so just big damage increase. Then we're going over 3 points into Endless Tempest to increase the duration of our Cataclysm to make sure it's up 100% of the time. Then we're going over 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You and your companions deal increased critical strike damage to poison enemies, which since we're Werewolf, Toxic Claws will poison everything. Now if you don't have the mythic chest piece that gives you 1 point into every passive, make sure you put a point into Toxic Claws. I don't have a point because I already get 1 from my chest piece. Then we're going over 3 points into Defiance. Nature skills do increase damage to elites. Natural Disasters, so our Storm skills do increase damage to CC'd enemies. Then 3 into Circle of Life, so our Nature magic skills that consume spirit will heal us. This is our primary healing. We're spamming out tornadoes. We're healing a lot. Then 3 into Catastrophe. You deal increased damage after using your ultimate. Ultimate's gonna have a pretty low cooldown in general, so we can get a big damage increase every time we pop it. Then we're going over 3 points into Quick Shift, shapeshifting into a new animal normal form grants increasing damage. That stacks up. Now this is lost after being in human form for 3 seconds, which will basically never be in human form for 3 seconds. So we stack this up and just keep it stacked. Then 1 point into heightened senses. When shapeshifting, werebear grants you damage reduction, werewolf grants you increased movement speed, and these will both persist as long as you're in each of the forms, which we'll constantly be in. Then finally, for our capstone, when you shapeshift into werebear, which we have 2 abilities to do, we gain massively increased damage, and when we go into werewolf, we get increased attack speed. Both of these bonuses will persist when you're in either form, which will always be in, so this is just massive damage increases overall. And that brings us to our spirit boons, and some of these were pretty heavily buffed with all of these buffs as well, which help out this build. So first we're taking wariness, take reduced damage from elites, then avian wraith, gain increased critical strike damage. This was buffed. Then iron feather for increased max life. This was buffed, so we actually have quite a bit of max life in a build. It doesn't really stack it as much as some other builds, especially werebear builds. Then we have calamity, extends the duration of ultimate skills by up to 35%. This was buffed. And then combo for the storm, a lucky hit. Nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds, so we can have our cataclysm up anytime we need it. Then we're going over to our mercenaries. For my main mercenary, I'm still using Variana, primarily because we're going to get a bunch of attack speed increases. You also get movement speed as her kind of base ability, which does help the build as well. But the primary reason we're taking it is Hysteria, so anytime Variana damages something, you get an increased attack speed up to 10%. Then Bloodlust, whenever she casts this, you gain increased attack speed, and then Bloodlust, so you gain even more attack speed from Bloodthirst. There's a lot of attack speed increases, which does help with this build. And then for my reinforcement, I'm using Rahir, so we can use Bastion, which he just pops this bubble that redirects 90% of the damage you would take to him. Also makes you unstoppable, and you can apply this to cast when you're injured, so you get low health. He pops up, uses this to save you, makes you unstoppable, makes you take massively reduced damage. If you never get this to proc, which I rarely do, you can also just change this up to some other damaging ability from any mercenary you want. And that brings us to our Paragon boards, and like always, we're primarily going over board and glyph selection, but there'll be a build planner in the description if you want to follow point by point. The first board, we're taking the Earth and Sky glyph, which will give us some pretty big damage to elites and damage increases. The secondary causes your nature skills to do increased damage to vulnerable and crowd-controlled enemies. The legendary just increases your nature magic damage. Then board 1, we're taking Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 spirit, you deal increased damage for 5 seconds. This will be up majority of the time. The glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another buff to core damage and just normal damage. The secondary gives you increased damage to close enemies around werewolf or werebear. The legendary increases your shapeshift damage. Then we're going over to the right. We're taking the Thundershock board. Storm skills do increase damage equal to 20% of your damage versus close and distant, up to 60%. I'm currently at 58%. That will go up a little bit as I optimize the build a bit more, but you really want to max this out as much as possible. Then the glyph we're taking is Outmatch, which buffs all rare nodes within range, so we get damage versus close, storm skill damage, some willpower. The secondary makes you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. The legendary just increases your damage. Then we're going down. We're taking the Heightened Malice board. When 3 or more enemies are poisoned near you, you deal massively increased damage. This will be up majority of the time. The glyph for taking is Spirit for increased critical strike damage. The secondary causes your crits to make enemies take more damage from you. Then the legendary increases your critical strike damage. Then for our final board, we're taking Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 spirits, which you really don't care about, but this was also buffed pretty recently and now gives you 50% increased critical strike damage as well. And the glyph for taking is Headhunter, which buffs all normal nodes within range, just gives us a bunch of stat increases. The secondary increases your damage to elites, and the legendary just increases your damage. And that brings us to our gear, starting with our gems. In your armor, you want increased willpower. In your jewelry, you want whatever is going to shore up your defenses, whether you need armor or increased resistances. And then for our runes, I'm currently using a bit of a harder to use mixture. There's a handful of different mixes of runes you can use. This one seems to be the best possible at the high end, but it's a bit harder to use. So first off, we're using Cast a Non-Channeled Core skill, which is easy to use. You just spam tornadoes, and this will invoke the Barbarian's Warcry, increasing your damage by 15%, which is multiplicative for 6 seconds. So we'll have this up a decent bit of the time. Then our other mixture is Stand Still while fighting for some amount of seconds, and when you do that, your next skill cast will be a guaranteed crit and overpower. And even though this isn't an overpower build, getting a tornado to be be an overpower cast actually makes it do a lot of damage because tornadoes keep proccing damage as they sit there on a target. So you can actually deal a lot of damage from a guaranteed overpower on a tornado. You do have to stand still for a while, but especially when you're on, say, a boss fight, tornado builds kind of want you to stand still for a while. But that brings us to our gear pieces, and there are a lot of uniques or mythics within this build. This is definitely going to be more of an end game focused build. You kind of need a lot of this stuff for a tornado build to be really good in the end game. But starting off, we have Tempest Roar with the special of storm skills have up to a 35% chance of grant force spirit, but we're primarily using it so your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills for a lot of different scaling. Then we're using the mythic chest piece Shroud of False Death. And the primary reason we're using this, it gives +1 to all passives, which is absurd, but also gives a lot of other really good stats. All stats is really good because it helps you get a lot of the secondary bonuses of the rare nodes throughout your Paragon boards, then some max life, and then stealth after not dealing damage will also help you move around a bit more quickly. Then we're going to be using the Wild Heart Hunger Boots. So shapeshifting into a new animal form increases the value of your bestial rage bonuses up to 50%. And this is also a big reason why we're taking Maul, so we can shapeshift back and forth to stack up this bonus for massively increased damage. Then we're using the Ring of Starless Skies. Spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of your skills, but it increases the damage by up to 50%. So just another big multiplicative increase. The stats on this ring are also very good. And then the Mjolnir ring, which is very important. While Cataclysm is active, you deal up to 100% increase of multiplicative damage and have unlimited spirit. This is why we don't really have to go into any spirit regeneration. Really, we don't have to go out of our way to get it because we just go into cooldown reduction and things for a Cataclysm. So we just have unlimited spirit at all times and deal massively increased damage at all times. But then past that, we have our legendary aspects. On our weapon, we have your core skills do up to 150% increased multiplicative damage based on your fortified, just a massive damage increase. On our necklace, after killing an enemy with shred, you gain 20 spirit, and your werewolf skills deal up to 60% increased multiplicative damage when cast above 50 spirit. So this is basically just a damage increase. We don't care about the shred part of it, but this is just a damage increase for our werewolf skills. And then as we went over, we have tornadoes will seek up to 5 targets and deal massively increased damage. And then for our one defensive aspect, we have when you use a shapeshifting skill that changes your form, heal for up to 25% of your max life, which is a big heal. If you are at full life, you gain that amount as fortify. So shapeshifting back and forth, which is something we'll already be doing, heals us a lot if we need it, or just gives us massive amounts of fortify. So very good for the defensive portions of our build. Now, some of the most important roles for our pieces of gear is gonna be mainly on our weapon. So chance for tornado projectiles to cast twice is gonna be absolutely massive. Getting out as many tornadoes possible is going to be very strong. Then on your necklace, just getting as many passive increases as you can get. I have wild impulses. You can get things like Envenom or any other passives that increase your damage. So you can get a much better necklace, but pretty much all of your other rolls are exactly what you'd expect. You want to get your armor capped, you want your resistances capped, and then whatever other damage rolls you can get. But we're using a lot of uniques, so you don't actually have to worry about getting a lot of really well-rolled gear for this build after you have the uniques. But that's pretty much the entirety of this build. It's nice that we now have a tornado build back to being at least a viable endgame build for the hardest difficulties. This build is doing a lot more damage than it used to. And if you're someone that really likes tornado builds, keep this build in mind for Season 7 because Season 7 is getting a lot of werewolf buffs. So there's going to be a lot of different elements that could potentially buff up this tornado build as well. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.